I watched from my kitchen window as 3 HOA board members stood on my front lawn, clipboards in hand, pointing at something behind my house. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips when I recognized the woman in the center. Patricia Hammond, the HOA president, wore her signature pearls and a scowl that could curdle milk. This couldn't be good. My name is Quentin Kowalski, and I had lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Scottsdale, Arizona for exactly 8 months. The subdivision was one of those planned communities that promised family-friendly neighborhoods, well-maintained common areas, and reasonable rules. What they didn't mention in the brochure was that the HOA board had recently been taken over by a group of busybodies with nothing better to do than micromanage everyone's lives. I opened the front door before they could ring the bell. "Can I help you?" Patricia's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Mr. Kowalski, good morning. We're conducting routine inspections of property boundaries and easements. We'll need to access your backyard." "For what exactly?" "That's board business," she said, already walking around the side of my house like she owned it. The other 2 board members, Gerald Chen and Sandra Mills, followed her like obedient ducklings. I hurried after them, my irritation rising. "Actually, you can't just walk onto my property without permission." Patricia didn't even slow down. "According to Section 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, the board has the right to inspect all properties for compliance issues and common area encroachments. My backyard isn't a common area." "We'll see about that," she said cryptically. We reached my backyard, which wasn't much to look at. A small patio, some desert landscaping I'd put in myself, and a whole lot of empty space. The previous owners had been minimalists, and I hadn't gotten around to doing much with it yet. The one thing I did know was exactly where my septic field was located. The house was on the edge of the development, and like about 30 other homes in the older section, it wasn't connected to the city sewer system. Instead, we had septic tanks and drain fields. Patricia walked to the back corner of my property, right where my septic field was buried under a layer of gravel and decorative rock. She pointed at it with one manicured finger. "This entire area is actually designated as common space." "Excuse me." She pulled out a rolled-up document from her leather portfolio. "According to the original plot plans, there's a 15-foot setback from your property line that's designated for community use. You've placed rocks and landscaping on it." I stared at her. "That's my septic field. It's been there for 20 years, long before you moved into this neighborhood." "Then it was placed there incorrectly," Patricia said, her voice sharp. "We're planning to expand parking in this section of the neighborhood. The community desperately needs more guest parking spaces, and this area is perfect. We'll be paving it next month." "You absolutely will not," I said, my voice rising. "That's my septic drain field. If you pave over it, sewage will back up into my house." Gerald finally spoke up, peering at me over his glasses. "Mr. Kowalski, if your septic system is indeed located on common property, that's a violation. You'll need to relocate it at your own expense." "It's not on common property. This is my land. I have a survey." "We have the original development plans," Patricia said smugly. "I think those trump your survey." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Fine. Show me these plans. Let me see exactly what you're talking about." She held the document up but didn't let me take it. "The plans clearly show the setback. Now, we need to take measurements." For the next 20 minutes, I watched helplessly as they measured, photographed, and made notes. Patricia seemed particularly pleased with herself, which only increased my sense of dread. When they finally left, she handed me a formal notice. "You have 30 days to remove any personal property from the common area. After that, the HOA will begin construction." "I'm calling a lawyer," I said. "You're welcome to waste your money," Patricia replied. "But the bylaws are very clear. The HOA board's decisions regarding common property are final." After they left, I immediately went to my filing cabinet and pulled out all my closing documents. The survey was clear. My property line extended well past where Patricia claimed it did. The septic field was entirely on my land, installed legally and permitted by the county. I had all the documentation. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb, who had handled my closing. He listened to my story and asked me to bring all my documents to his office that afternoon. "This sounds like either a mistake or a power play," Marcus said, spreading my survey out on his desk next to the document Patricia had showed me. These two documents completely contradict each other. So what do? First, we send them a certified letter with your survey and septic permits, clearly stating that they have no right to pave your property. Second, we file for a temporary restraining order if they try to proceed. Third, and this is important, you document everything. They seemed pretty confident they had the right to do this. Marcus frowned, studying the HOA's document more closely. This plot plan they showed you looks old, maybe from the initial concept phase, but it's not stamped by a surveyor or the county. Your survey is official, recorded, and legally binding. They don't have a leg to stand on. Then why are they doing this? Could be incompetence, could be that Patricia Hammond doesn't like being told no. I've dealt with HOA boards before. Some of them think they're running a small kingdom. We sent the letter that day, clearly outlining the legal facts and warning the HOA that any attempt to pave over my septic field would result in immediate legal action. I felt better after that, confident that once they saw the official documents, they'd back down. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I came home from my job at the engineering firm to find survey stakes in my backyard. Orange spray paint marked out a rectangle that covered my entire septic field and extended several feet beyond it. A notice was taped to my back door announcing that construction would begin in 1 week. I called Marcus immediately. They're ignoring us. Then we go to court, he said. I'll file for an emergency restraining order tomorrow morning. Don't worry, Quentin. They can't just bulldoze your property. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, but the judge couldn't see us until the afternoon. I took the day off work, sick with anxiety. Marcus assured me it was a straightforward case. We had all the documentation. The HOA had nothing but an old, unstamped concept drawing. That morning, I was woken at 6 by the sound of heavy machinery. I ran to my back window and felt my stomach drop. A paving crew was already setting up in my backyard. A small excavator was being unloaded from a trailer. Patricia Hammond stood nearby with a contractor, pointing and directing. I threw on clothes and ran outside. "Stop! You can't do this!" The contractor, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, looked uncomfortable. "I'm just doing the job I was hired for, buddy. This is my property. I have a court hearing this afternoon." Patricia strode over, looking triumphant. "The HOA board voted to expedite this project. We're well within our rights. You're committing property damage. This is illegal." "Call the police if you want," she said dismissively. "We have all the proper permits." I did exactly that. The Scottsdale Police Department sent an officer who looked bored until I showed him my survey and explained about the septic field. His expression changed. "Madam, if this is his property, you need to stop work immediately." Patricia pulled out a folder full of documents. "Officer, this is HOA common property. We have the authority to improve it as we see fit. This resident is the one trespassing with his illegal septic installation." The officer looked between us, clearly not wanting to get involved in what he saw as a civil dispute. "Look, you two have conflicting documents. This isn't a criminal matter. You need to let a judge sort it out." "We have a hearing this afternoon," I said desperately. "Then I suggest you get the work stopped by the court," the officer said. "Unless someone is in immediate danger, I can't stop a construction crew based on disputed property documents." I called Marcus in a panic. He was already on his way to file emergency paperwork. "Stall them. Take photos of everything. I'm going to try to get a judge on the phone." But the legal system moves slowly, even in emergencies. By the time Marcus got through to a judge's clerk, the excavator had already torn up half of my landscaping. I stood in my yard, filming everything, as the crew prepared to start digging. The contractor walked over to me, pulling off his work gloves. "Look, man, I gotta say something. They told me this was just an empty field. Nobody said anything about a septic system. If we pave over your drain field, your house is going to be in serious trouble." "I know that. They know that. They don't care." He looked back at Patricia, who was on her phone, deliberately ignoring both of us. "I don't like this, but I signed a contract. If I walk away, they'll sue me." "Do what you have to do," I said tiredly. "I'm documenting all of it." Marcus called back an hour later with bad news. "The earliest we can get in front of a judge is this afternoon at 3. I've got an emergency motion filed, but the court won't stop the work without a hearing. They'll be done by then." "I know. Quentin, this is going to be ugly. If they pave over your septic field, the damage is going to be significant. Make sure you document everything. We're going to sue them for every penny. By noon, they had laid gravel and were preparing to pour asphalt. Patricia had been joined by other HOA board members, all of them watching like they were at some kind of victory celebration. I recognized a few neighbors in the small crowd that had gathered. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed to support the HOA's actions. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 2 houses down, came over to me. "Quentin, I'm so sorry. This is wrong. Several of us tried to fight Patricia on this at the last board meeting, but she railroaded it through." "Did she say why she's so determined to do this?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "Between you and me, I think she's never forgiven you for that incident at the pool last summer." I remembered. Patricia's adult son had been visiting and had been drinking heavily at the community pool, harassing some of the teenage girls. I'd asked him to leave, and when he got belligerent, I'd called security. Patricia had been humiliated, but surely she wouldn't destroy my property over something so petty. Looking at her satisfied expression as the asphalt truck arrived, I realized she absolutely would. "This is going to cost you $50,000 in damages," I called out to her. "My lawyer's going to take you apart in court." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "By the time the court's sorted out, you'll have spent more in legal fees than your house is worth, and the HOA has insurance for this sort of thing, do you?" That's when I realized this was calculated. She knew she'd probably lose in court eventually. She just didn't care because it wasn't her money. The HOA would pay, which meant all the homeowners would pay through increased fees. But I would be the one living with sewage backing up into my house until the legal system slowly ground its way to justice. The asphalt went down in a smooth, black sheet, completely covering my septic field. The crew added bright yellow parking space lines. It looked professional and permanent. Patricia took photos like a proud parent at a graduation. At 3 o'clock, I was in court. The judge, an older woman named Catherine Rivera, listened to both sides and examined our documents. Her expression grew darker as she studied the HOA's paperwork. "This isn't an official survey," she said, holding up Patricia's document. "This appears to be a preliminary concept drawing, and it's not even consistent with the recorded plat for the subdivision." Patricia's lawyer, a nervous young man who clearly knew his client didn't have a case, stammered, "Your Honor, the HOA board made their decision in good faith based on documents they believed to be accurate." "Good faith?" Judge Rivera's voice was sharp. "Mr. Kowalski's attorney sent you a certified letter 2 weeks ago with the official survey. You proceeded anyway. That's not good faith, counselor. That's willful destruction of property." "The work is already complete, Your Honor," the lawyer said weakly. Then it will be uncompleted," Judge Rivera said. "I'm issuing an immediate order requiring the HOA to remove the paving, restore the property, and pay for any damage to Mr. Kowalski's septic system. Furthermore, I'm ordering an emergency inspection of the system by a licensed contractor at the HOA's expense. If there's any damage, they'll pay for repairs or replacement." I felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone with authority who understood what had happened. "Your Honor," Patricia's lawyer tried again, "removing the paving will be expensive." "Not as expensive as what this will cost your client when Mr. Kowalski sues for damages," Judge Rivera said. "And counselor, you might want to inform your client that willful destruction of property can carry criminal penalties as well. I'm giving them 1 week to begin remediation. If they don't comply, I'll hold the board members in contempt." When I got home, there was a new sign planted at the edge of the fresh parking lot. HOA parking only. Violators will be towed. Patricia wasn't giving up. Over the next few days, I watched nervously for any signs of septic trouble. The system seemed to be functioning, but I knew that paving over the drain field would eventually cause problems. The soil needed to be able to breathe and filter. Covered in asphalt, the wastewater had nowhere to go. The HOA, unsurprisingly, didn't comply with the court order. Instead, they filed an appeal. Marcus had warned me they'd probably try to drag things out. Meanwhile, residents started parking on my former septic field. Every day, cars filled the spaces. Patricia had won, at least temporarily. Then, 3 weeks after the paving, I woke to shouting outside. I looked out to see Patricia standing in the parking lot, screaming at 2 residents. Even from my window, I could see why. The parking lot had developed a distinct smell, not just unpleasant, but a sewage smell that was getting stronger by the day. I went outside to investigate. The odor was overwhelming. Several residents were standing around their parked cars looking disgusted. "Something died under there," one man said, holding his nose. I knew exactly what was happening. My septic drain field, unable to properly disperse wastewater through the soil, was backing up. The sewage was pooling under the asphalt, and the smell was seeping through cracks and edges. "You need to move your cars," I told them. "That's sewage, not a dead animal." Patricia whirled on me. "This is your fault. Your septic system is faulty." "My septic system is fine. It's just buried under a parking lot, which is causing it to fail exactly like I told you it would." "You need to fix this immediately." I stared at her in disbelief. "Fix it? You paved over it? The only way to fix it is to remove the asphalt, which is what the judge ordered you to do 3 weeks ago." More residents were gathering now, drawn by the commotion and the smell. Some had their phones out, filming. Patricia's face was turning red. "This is a health hazard," she sputtered. "I'm reporting you to the county." "Go ahead," I said. "I'll give them the court order showing you were told not to pave it in the first place." Over the next 2 days, the situation got dramatically worse. The smell intensified until it was detectable from the street. Residents started complaining to the HOA, demanding action. Patricia sent me a formal violation notice, claiming my septic system was creating a nuisance and demanding I repair it within 48 hours or face daily fines. Marcus laughed when I showed him the notice. "She's delusional. Save this. It's more evidence of bad faith." Then, nature took its inevitable course. On the morning of the 4th day, I woke to screaming. Real, terrified screaming. I ran outside to see sewage bubbling up through cracks in the asphalt. But it wasn't just seeping. The pressure that had built up underground had found weak points, and raw sewage was erupting in small geysers, flooding the parking lot. Cars were parked throughout the lot, their owners asleep in their homes, unaware of the disaster unfolding. Brown, foul-smelling wastewater was pooling around tires, flowing under vehicles. One car, parked at the lowest point, was sitting in several inches of sewage. Residents poured out of their homes in bathrobes and pajamas, some gagging at the smell, others standing in shock. Patricia emerged from her house 3 doors down, took one look at the scene, and started screaming at me. "You did this! You sabotaged your own septic system!" "Are you insane?" I shouted back. "I warned you this would happen. Everyone warned you. You're going to pay for every car that's damaged." Several car owners were crying, trying to move their vehicles but afraid to wade through the sewage. One woman was on the phone with her insurance company, her voice shaking. A man was taking photos of his BMW's luxury interior, the carpets already soaked with contaminated water. I called Marcus, who told me to call the county health department immediately. "This is a public health emergency now," he said. "The county will shut it down and force the HOA to act." The health inspector arrived within an hour, a harried-looking woman named Dr. Sarah Chen. She took one look at the parking lot and made a phone call. Within minutes, she was cordoning off the area with yellow tape. "This entire area is condemned," she announced to the gathered crowd. "No one is to enter it. The sewage presents a serious health risk. The responsible party needs to begin cleanup immediately." Patricia pushed forward. "He's the responsible party," she pointed at me. "It's his septic system." Dr. Chen looked at her clipboard. "You're the HOA president? Then you're responsible. This parking lot is on HOA common property, correct?" "Well, yes, but then it's your responsibility to maintain it safely. You'll need to hire a hazmat cleanup crew immediately. I'm also ordering that the asphalt be removed and the underlying area properly remediated. I'll need a full environmental assessment." "That will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, Doctor." Chen's expression was unsympathetic. "You should have thought of that before paving over a septic field. I have the complaint history here. Mr. Kowalski notified you in writing that this would happen. You proceeded anyway. I'm also forwarding this to the county attorney's office for potential criminal charges." Patricia's face went pale. "Criminal charges?" "Knowing creation of a public health hazard," Dr. Chen said. "It's a serious offense in Arizona." The next few hours were chaos. The hazmat team arrived in protective suits, clearing the area. The fire department came to help wash down the affected vehicles, though several owners were already crying about ruined interiors. News crews showed up, filming the disaster. By evening, our subdivision was the lead story on 3 local stations. HOA disaster, sewage floods neighborhood. I gave an interview to one reporter, carefully explaining the timeline. I showed them my court documents, the warning letter, the judge's order. Marcus had advised me to be factual and calm, and I followed his advice. Patricia, on the other hand, gave an unhinged interview where she blamed me, the contractor, the previous homeowners, and even the county for not preventing her from making her disastrous decision. The next morning, I found a summons taped to my door. The HOA was suing me for $250,000 in damages, claiming my defective septic system had caused the disaster and that I had failed to properly maintain it. Marcus was waiting for this. "Perfect," he said when I called him. "Now we countersue for property damage, trespass, emotional distress, and legal fees, and we file a class action on behalf of all the homeowners whose cars were damaged." A class action? Think about it. The HOA's insurance will cover some of this, but they'll raise everyone's fees to cover the rest. Every homeowner in that subdivision is now a victim of Patricia Hammond's vendetta against you. Many of them will want their money back. He was right. Over the next few days, as homeowners received estimates for repairing their cars, and the HOA sent out a special assessment notice for $3,500 per household to cover the cleanup costs, anger turned against the board. A petition started circulating demanding Patricia's resignation. Meetings were called. The neighborhood Facebook page, which I'd mostly ignored, exploded with hundreds of angry posts. Mrs. Henderson organized a recall effort. "Patricia and her cronies need to go," she told me when she came by with the petition. "This is insane. My car interior is ruined, and now I have to pay $3,500 for the privilege? No, we're voting them out." The recall election was scheduled for 3 weeks out, but the county attorney's office moved faster. 2 detectives showed up at my door, asking me to walk them through everything that had happened. I provided copies of all my documentation, the warning letters, the court orders, everything. "This is pretty clear-cut," Detective Williams said, making notes. "They were explicitly warned. They ignored a court order, and they created a public health hazard. We'll be recommending charges." Patricia Hammond, Gerald Chen, and Sandra Mills were charged with reckless endangerment and willful destruction of property 2 days before the recall election. The news made headlines again. Patricia hired a criminal defense attorney and stopped appearing in public. The recall election was almost anti-climery because all 3 had resigned from the board to focus on their legal defense. An interim board was elected, with Mrs. Henderson as president. Her first act was to settle with me out of court. The HOA agreed to pay for complete removal and replacement of the parking lot, restoration of my property, replacement of my septic system with a new, upgraded one, and $75,000 in damages. They also agreed to pay my legal fees, which had climbed past $30,000. The class action on behalf of the car owners was settled separately, with the HOA's insurance company paying out over $400,000 in claims. The insurance company then sued the former board members personally for fraud and misrepresentation, claiming they had deliberately hidden the warnings they had received. The criminal case went to trial 6 months later. I testified about the warnings, the court order, and Patricia's determination to proceed despite everything. The contractor testified that he'd expressed concerns but had been assured everything was legal. Dr. Chen from the health department provided expert testimony about the predictable consequences of paving over a septic field. Patricia's defense was that she had relied on old documents and believed she was acting within HOA authority. The jury didn't buy it. All 3 former board members were convicted of reckless endangerment and destruction of property. Patricia received 6 months in jail, which was reduced to 3 months plus 2 years probation. Gerald and Sandra got probation and community service, having been convinced by prosecutors to testify against Patricia in exchange for reduced sentences. The civil lawsuits dragged on longer. Patricia was personally sued by 17 different homeowners whose cars had been damaged. Her homeowner's insurance denied coverage, arguing that the damage was intentional. She filed for bankruptcy 8 months after the sewage flood, losing her house in the process. Gerald and Sandra also faced financial ruin, though their culpability was considered less severe because they had simply followed Patricia's lead. As for me, I ended up with a brand new septic system, professionally landscaped yard, and enough money from the settlement to finally do the renovations I'd been planning. The parking lot was removed and the area was turned into a community garden instead. Mrs. Henderson made sure I got input on the design. "No more parking lots," she said firmly at the planning meeting. "We learned that lesson." The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though the story became legendary in Scottsdale HOA circles. Real estate agents used it as a cautionary tale. HOA board training seminars referenced it as an example of what not to do. Patricia Hammond became shorthand for HOA overreach. I ran into the contractor about a year later at a hardware store. He recognized me and came over to apologize. "I should have walked away from that job," he said. "I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't want the hassle of breaking the contract." "You tried to warn them," I said. "Patricia was determined to do it no matter what anyone said." "Yeah, well, it cost me too. Word got around that I was involved in that disaster. Lost some business, had to spend time in court. Lesson learned, I guess. Now if something seems sketchy, I walk away. Not worth it." The Homeowners Association was never quite the same after the scandal. The new board operated with extreme caution, always getting multiple opinions before making any decisions, always checking and double-checking property boundaries and legal authority. They brought in a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, removing the kind of personal vendettas that had driven Patricia. Some people moved away, unable to look at the former parking lot without remembering the smell and the horror of that morning. Housing prices in the neighborhood dipped for about a year before recovering. New residents would hear the story and look at me with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. "You're the septic field guy?" they'd say. "We heard about what happened. That was crazy." I became something of a local celebrity, at least within the subdivision. People would ask my opinion on HOA proposals, wanting to make sure nothing like the parking lot disaster would happen again. I was even asked to join the board, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. The most satisfying moment came about 18 months after the incident. I was working in my new garden, which had been professionally designed and included a small water feature and a variety of native Arizona plants. A car pulled up and a woman got out with a clipboard. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm Jennifer Lawson from the Arizona HOA Reform Coalition. I wanted to talk to you about your experience." She explained that several state legislators were proposing reforms to HOA laws in Arizona, creating stronger protections for homeowners and clearer penalties for board members who abused their authority. My case was being used as a primary example of what could go wrong. "Would you be willing to testify at a committee hearing?" Jennifer asked. "Your story really illustrates why these reforms are necessary." I agreed, and 3 months later I found myself at the state capitol, telling my story to a room full of legislators. It was surreal, sitting at a table with a microphone, explaining how Patricia Hammond had paved over my septic field out of spite and created a public health disaster. The reforms passed 6 months later. They included requirements for professional management of HOAs over a certain size, mandatory insurance for board members, strict protocols for property modifications, and easier recall procedures for homeowners to remove bad actors. The bill was informally called the Septic Field Protection Act, though its official name was much more boring. Patricia Hammond finished her jail sentence and moved out of state. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd gone to live with family in Ohio. Gerald Chen stayed in Scottsdale, but kept a very low profile, never attending community events. Sandra Mills actually apologized to me at the grocery store about 2 years after everything happened. "I should have stood up to Patricia," she said, looking genuinely remorseful. "I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I just went along with it. I'm sorry for all the trouble it caused you." "I appreciate that," I said. "I hope you learned from it." "I learned I should trust my instincts," she said. "And I learned that HOA board positions attract some people who just want power over their neighbors. I should never have run for the board in the first place." The financial impact on the HOA was substantial and long-lasting. Between the cleanup costs, legal settlements, insurance premium increases, and the cost of hiring professional management, homeowner fees increased by 40% over 2 years. Some residents grumbled, but most accepted it as the price of the disaster. A few homeowners even tried to sue Patricia personally to recover their increased fees, though those cases were dismissed because her bankruptcy had already been finalized. The community garden that replaced the parking lot became surprisingly popular. Mrs. Henderson organized it into plots that residents could rent for a small annual fee. It became a gathering place where neighbors would work side by side, planting tomatoes and peppers and herbs. Kids would run between the rows, learning about gardening. It was everything a community space should be. I kept my own plot there, growing vegetables and sharing them with neighbors. It was healing, in a way, to see something positive come from the space that had caused so much trouble. Sometimes I'd look at the neat rows of plants and remember what had been there before. The asphalt, the sewage, the screaming car owners. It seemed impossible that it had all really happened. The legal system had worked eventually, though it had taken far too long and cost too much. Judge Rivera's initial order should have been enough, but Patricia's stubbornness and the HOA's deep pockets had allowed them to ignore it until disaster struck. The reforms that came afterward helped, but I knew that somewhere in Arizona and across the country there were probably other Patricia Hammonds serving on HOA boards, making life miserable for their neighbors. My story got picked up by national media at one point. I was interviewed for an article in a major magazine about HOA horror stories. The writer called it a perfect storm of petty vindictiveness and bureaucratic overreach. I couldn't argue with that assessment. Friends and family who had heard about the incident but didn't know the full story would ask me about it. Did sewage really flood a parking lot? And they'd say, laughing at the absurdity of it. I'd tell them yes and explain how it had happened, and watch their expressions change from amusement to horror as they realized the deliberate nature of what Patricia had done. She went to jail for that? They'd ask, and I'd nod. 3 months. Could have been more, but she took a plea deal. The whole experience changed how I viewed community living. I'd always thought HOAs were just minor annoyances, places where busybodies complained about lawn heights and paint colors. I'd learned they could be much worse, weaponized by the wrong people into tools of harassment and destruction. But I'd also learned that the system, while slow and imperfect, did eventually work. Justice had been served, even if it took too long. I also learned the importance of documentation. If I hadn't kept meticulous records, photographed everything, and maintained copies of all correspondence, the outcome might have been very different. Patricia might have successfully painted me as the villain, the homeowner with the defective septic system who refused to take responsibility. Instead, I had proof of every warning, every attempt to prevent the disaster, every example of the HOA's willful disregard for safety and property rights. Marcus, my attorney, used my case in his marketing materials. Represented Quentin Kowalski in landmark HOA abuse case, his website now read. He'd become something of an expert in HOA law, and business was booming. Apparently, my case had inspired other homeowners to fight back against their own neighborhood tyrants. The new HOA board under Mrs. Henderson operated with transparency and common sense. They published detailed minutes of every meeting. They consulted with attorneys before making any significant decisions. They held town halls where residents could voice concerns. It was night and day compared to Patricia's regime. About 3 years after the septic field disaster, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include my story in a series about HOA abuses. I agreed and spent several days being interviewed on camera, walking through the timeline, showing the location where everything had happened. The documentary aired on a streaming service about a year later and became surprisingly popular, sparking renewed interest in HOA reform nationwide. I appeared on a few podcasts to discuss the documentary and my experience. The hosts were always incredulous that anyone would deliberately pave over a septic field. Didn't she know what would happen? They'd ask. She knew, I'd reply. She just didn't care. She was more interested in asserting her authority and punishing me than in considering the consequences. But she went to jail. Yes, but not before causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage and creating a health hazard for an entire neighborhood. The criminal penalties came too late to prevent the disaster. Those interviews usually spark discussions about accountability and the kinds of people who seek power in small organizations. HOA boards, school boards, neighborhood councils. These positions often attracted well-meaning people who wanted to improve their communities. But they also attracted people like Patricia Hammond, who saw them as opportunities to control others and settle personal scores. My life eventually returned to normal, or at least a new normal. I dated, worked, maintained my house and garden. The septic field incident became a story I'd tell at parties, always getting shocked reactions. Some people didn't believe it had really happened until I showed them the news articles and court documents. I never ran into Patricia Hammond again, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't sure what I'd say to her if I did. Part of me wanted to ask if she thought it had all been worth it, if destroying my property and creating a disaster had satisfied whatever grudge she'd been holding. But I suspected she'd never admit she'd been wrong. People like Patricia rarely did. The community garden thrived, expanding into the second year. Mrs. Henderson added benches in a small pavilion where residents could sit in the shade. It became a gathering place for neighborhood events, birthday parties, and summer barbecues. The transformation from disaster zone to community hub was complete. I kept in touch with some of the other homeowners who'd been affected by the sewage flood. We'd formed a sort of bond through shared trauma. We'd joke darkly about our experience, calling ourselves the sewage survivors. It was gallows humor, but it helped. One of them, a man named Robert Carlson, whose Mercedes had been totaled by sewage damage, became a good friend. We'd have dinner occasionally, and he'd always bring up the incident. "I still can't believe it happened," he'd say, shaking his head. "I mean, who does that? Who paves over a septic field?" "Patricia Hammond," I'd reply, and we'd both laugh. "I hope she learned her lesson in jail," Robert said once. "I doubt it," I replied. "People like that don't learn. They just blame everyone else." The financial settlements I received helped me achieve some goals I'd been putting off. I renovated my kitchen, upgraded my home office, and even took a long overdue vacation to Europe. The money couldn't erase what had happened, but it at least provided some compensation for the stress and hassle. Marcus and I stayed in touch even after the legal cases were concluded. He'd call occasionally to update me on HOA reform efforts, or to ask if I'd be willing to consult on other cases. I always agreed. If my terrible experience could help someone else avoid a similar situation, it was worth my time. The Scottsdale City Council even invited me to speak at a forum on HOA governance. I told my story to a room full of city officials, HOA board members, and concerned homeowners. The reaction was everything from sympathy to outrage to disbelief. Several current board members approached me afterward to say my story had made them rethink how they operated their own associations. "We have rules about paint colors and landscaping," one woman said, "but I never thought about what could happen if we overstepped our authority on something serious. Your story is a wake-up call." That was gratifying to hear. If Patricia Hammond's vindictive actions led to better, more responsible HOA governance across the city or state, then at least some good had come from the disaster. I also became more involved in local politics, attending city council meetings and weighing in on housing and development issues. My experience had taught me that local decisions mattered, that the people making rules for your community could have enormous impact on your life. I wasn't going to be passive anymore. The neighborhood slowly forgot about the incident, at least on the surface. New residents moved in who hadn't been there for the sewage flood. They'd hear about it from neighbors, but it was history to them, not a lived experience. The community garden was just a community garden, not a former disaster site. But those of us who'd been there would never forget. We'd see that space and remember the smell, the horror, the shock of realizing that someone's vindictiveness could cause such destruction. It was a lesson in the importance of checks and balances, of not giving too much power to any individual or small group, no matter how mundane the organization seemed. I kept all the news articles, court documents, and photos from the incident in a file. Sometimes I'd look through them, still amazed at how out of control everything had gotten. The photo of sewage geysers erupting through the parking lot asphalt was particularly surreal. It looked like something from a movie, not real life. But it had been real. Patricia Hammond had deliberately paved over my septic field, despite multiple warnings, created a public health disaster, ruined dozens of cars, cost homeowners hundreds of thousands of dollars, and ended up in jail. All because I'd once asked her drunk son to leave the pool. The disproportion between the perceived slight and the revenge was staggering. A reasonable person would have let it go, or at most given me some minor HOA violation notices. Patricia had chosen to destroy my property and, in the process, damaged the entire community. Sometimes I wondered what her family thought about it all. She'd lost her home, served jail time, and become infamous in HOA circles. Her adult son, the one whose behavior had started everything, had apparently disappeared from her life, embarrassed by his mother's actions. Her husband had divorced her during the criminal proceedings. She'd sacrificed everything for her vendetta. Mrs. Henderson and I would sometimes discuss Patricia when we were working in the garden together. I knew she could be difficult, Mrs. Henderson would say, but I never imagined she'd go that far. There were so many off-ramps, so many chances to back down. She just kept doubling down. Pride, I'd suggest. She couldn't admit she was wrong. Pride and power, Mrs. Henderson agreed. She loved being HOA president. It made her feel important. When you challenged her authority, even inadvertently, she couldn't let it go. The psychological analysis didn't make me feel better, but it helped me understand what had happened. Patricia hadn't been thinking rationally. She'd been operating from a place of ego and wounded pride. My septic field had just been collateral damage in her personal war. Life moved on. Seasons changed. The desert landscape around Scottsdale shifted from the intense heat of summer to the mild perfection of winter and back again. The community garden produced tomatoes and peppers, then lay dormant, then produced again. Children grew. Neighbors moved in and out. The subdivision continued its life cycle. But the memory of that morning when sewage erupted through the parking lot remained vivid for those of us who'd been there. It was the kind of event that became a marker in time. Before the septic disaster, or after the sewage flood, it had changed our neighborhood forever, mostly for the better, but at a terrible cost. I'd achieved something I never wanted. I'd become the face of HOA reform in Arizona, possibly beyond. My name was in legislative records, court precedents, and documentary films. Future homeowners would read about my case when researching HOA rights and responsibilities. Attorneys would cite my experience in their arguments. I was part of legal history, which was both odd and somewhat satisfying. The one thing I hadn't achieved was a personal apology from Patricia Hammond. Sandra Mills had apologized, showing genuine remorse. Gerald Chen had sent a letter through his attorney expressing regret, though it felt less sincere. But Patricia had never admitted wrongdoing, never acknowledged the damage she'd caused. According to Mrs. Henderson, who kept tabs on such things, Patricia maintained to this day that she'd been acting within her authority and that I was somehow to blame for everything. That level of denial was almost impressive. Even after jail time, financial ruin, and becoming a cautionary tale, she couldn't admit she'd been wrong. I'd stopped expecting an apology years ago. People like Patricia Hammond didn't apologize. They just moved on and found new people to blame. I'd learned a lot from the experience, lessons I'd never wanted to learn but that had proven valuable. I'd learned that you can't always reason with unreasonable people. I'd learned that documentation and evidence are crucial when facing an adversary with institutional power. I'd learned that the legal system, while imperfect, can eventually provide justice. And I'd learned that communities can recover from even spectacular disasters if they work together and learn from their mistakes. The story of my septic field had become larger than just my personal experience. It represented something bigger: the dangers of unchecked authority in small organizations, the importance of accountability, and the need for legal protections for individuals against institutional overreach. It wasn't the legacy I'd have chosen, but it was the one I had. As I worked in the community garden on a pleasant Arizona evening, pulling weeds from around my tomato plants, I reflected on how far we'd all come. The physical scars of the disaster were gone, paved over with good intentions and growing things. The legal and financial consequences had mostly been resolved. Life had returned to something approaching normal. But the memory remained, and with it, the lessons. I'd never again assume that people in positions of minor authority would act reasonably. I'd never again fail to document every interaction when dealing with an adversarial HOA or similar organization. And I'd never again underestimate the damage that one vindictive person could cause when given a little bit of power and no effective oversight. The sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The community garden was peaceful, a place of growth and cooperation. It was hard to imagine that 3 years ago, this spot had been covered in sewage, a disaster zone that made national news. But it had happened, every surreal moment of it. Patricia Hammond had paved a parking lot over my septic field, ignored warnings and court orders, and created a public health disaster that destroyed cars, cost homeowners a fortune, and sent her to jail. It was a story so absurd it was almost funny, except for all the real damage it had caused. I finished my gardening and walked back to my house, past the spot where the parking lot had been, where sewage had erupted through the asphalt, where everything had gone so terribly wrong. Now it was just earth and plants, benches and pathways. The transformation was complete. Inside my renovated house, I poured a glass of wine and sat on my back patio, looking out at the garden. Mrs. Henderson was still there, watering her plot. Robert Carlson had arrived and was checking on his peppers. Other neighbors were scattered throughout the space, tending their plants, chatting with each other, enjoying the evening. This was what community was supposed to be. Not parking lots and petty vendettas, but shared spaces and mutual support. Patricia Hammond had tried to turn the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and it had backfired spectacularly. The new board had learned from her mistakes and created something better. My phone buzzed with an email from Marcus, another HOA case, another homeowner being bullied by an overreaching board. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide a statement about my experience. I typed out a quick reply. Yes, happy to help, happy. If my terrible experience could prevent even one person from going through something similar, it was worth reliving the story one more time. The septic field disaster would never truly be over for me. It had become part of my identity, a defining experience that shaped how I viewed community governance and individual rights. But I'd survived it. I'd fought back, won in court, and seen justice served. My property had been restored, my losses compensated, and the person responsible held accountable. In the end, despite everything Patricia Hammond had done, I'd come out ahead. The desert night settled over Scottsdale, quiet and peaceful. Somewhere in Ohio, Patricia Hammond was living whatever life she'd managed to rebuild after her catastrophic decisions. I didn't hate her anymore. I'd moved past that. I just felt sorry for someone so consumed by pettiness that they'd destroyed their own life trying to destroy someone else's. As for me, I was home, in my house, in my neighborhood, surrounded by good people who'd learned hard lessons about governance and accountability. The parking lot was gone, the septic field was restored, the community was stronger. And if anyone ever asked if I'd live in another HOA-controlled neighborhood, I'd laugh and say maybe, but only after thoroughly researching the board members and making sure none of them were named Patricia. The story of how an HOA paved a parking lot over my septic field and blamed me when sewage flooded their cars had taught me that much at least. Some lessons you only need to learn once.